And welcome. My name's Pepe Martinez and I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, and I'm one of 600 members of the Association of Professional Tour Guides, and we manage these Guide London live broadcasts and the Guide London website. Now, back in March, like many of you, we went into lockdown, and so rather than sitting at home polishing up our shiny badges waiting for visitors never to arrive, we decided to bring London to the world. And so every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 4 o'clock London time, we go out live simultaneously on Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. And so if this is your first time joining us today, welcome. And wherever you are in the world, please do let us know. We'd love to hear where you're from. And also, if you have any questions as well, please do let us know your questions. So also, you can share these broadcasts with your friends. And so let's try and keep London at the top of your consciousness. So when lockdown and travel restrictions end, hopefully London will be at the top of your list. And so every week we try to cover different subjects relating to London museums, British culture, some of its great sites, but also some of the great literary figures. And today we've got an entire programme devoted to one of the titans of English literature. Now, you might be aware that yesterday was the 150th anniversary of the death of Charles Dickens. Now, we don't normally celebrate the death of anyone, but when you're in that kind of league, well, we like to celebrate you as much as possible. Now, it could have been a very different start for Charles Dickens because as a young boy, his father was put in prison for debt. And so he was yanked out of school, and every morning he would walk from near London Bridge to work in a factory. And his job was putting labels on jars of blacking that was then used to put boot polish on boots. Now, that could have stunted the prospects of most young boys, but he perhaps used it to influence his writing in his later life. And he very quickly, as an adult man, went from being a journalist to one of the most famous writers in the world. Now, I'm going to introduce you to my lovely colleague, Simon, and he's going to tell you more about Charles Dickens and introduce you to our very special guest today. So, Simon, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, Pepe. Good afternoon to everyone tuning in this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Yes, it's my absolute delight to be hosting this Dickens 150th anniversary. I, along with many of my colleagues, have the great pleasure of guiding our visitors, of course, all over London. And wherever we go, we're in the footsteps of Charles Dickens, because Dickens knew London like the back of his hand. And he was perhaps, in a way, the original tourist guide. Actually, he would show visitors around the city. And ever since I was a child, I first read Great Expectations. That's when I fell in love with his writing and realized, even then, I think that he was this fantastic storyteller, perhaps the greatest storyteller we've ever known. And as guides, we describe ourselves as storytellers. And so in a way, I hope we're combining those two things, continuing that storytelling with our visitors. And bringing Dickens' life and works to the wider public, really. So this is a very special week for us. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today in our studio by an author, art historian, broadcaster, lecturer, travel writer, and, as it happens, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens. So I'd like to introduce to you Lucinda Hawksley. Hello, Lucinda.
Hello.
Hello. First of all, we're really delighted to have you with us because I know you've had an incredibly busy week. Yesterday you had a Dickens marathon, of course, on the anniversary.
Absolutely. It was amazing, but it definitely was a marathon.
Yes, 11 hours of live broadcasting yesterday, I believe.
11 hours of the Dickens conference, which was wonderful, plus popping out to do radio interviews and popping over to other Zoom rooms to look at what was happening elsewhere. It was quite phenomenal, including what should have been the wreath laying at Westminster Abbey at Poets' Corner at Dickens's grave, which of course wasn't, but a lot of people joined to see the speech by the president of the Dickens Fellowship, who happens to be my cousin, Ian Dickens. So I just spent the whole day going between different platforms and having an amazing time seeing people commemorating Charles Dickens.
Wonderful. Well, in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to attempt to cram this absolutely extraordinary life as best we can. And I suppose, really, as you mentioned Westminster Abbey, we're going to bring up our first image, actually, of the great man. And I think probably this is the image, or one of the images that people really associate with Dickens. This, I think, was taken in 1868 during his second visit to the United States, just 2 years before he died. I think you can see there he's definitely aged, and that sort of famous beard. So I think we should start probably with his death and his burial at Westminster Abbey. So if we just move to the next image, that's, you just mentioned that, Lucinda. So this is where Charles Dickens is buried, in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. And of course, when we take visitors there, I mean, people are really often surprised and delighted that Dickens is there in the great pantheon of English writers. But Lucinda, he didn't want to be buried in Westminster Abbey, did he?
No, he didn't. He didn't want any kind of pomp and ceremony. And what he'd actually asked for, what he requested, was to be buried at Rochester in Kent, which was near where he was living. He'd moved out of London and he was living in Kent. However, it was decided by the powers that be that he had to be in Poets' Corner because he was the great Charles Dickens. So there was a lot of controversy, and Rochester were kind of building a grave for him, and then Westminster Abbey took over, and he was laid to rest in Poets' Corner, which I think actually, in some ways, he would have been amazed by, because there's the memorial to Shakespeare there, and Dickens was a huge fan of Shakespeare. I think what he was really hoping to avoid was the huge pomp and ceremony and those kind of enormous grave memorials that the Victorians loved to erect with kind of weeping angels and all sorts of things. So what he wanted was something incredibly simple. And people are often amazed when I show them this, that there's not even his middle names in there. There's no mention of him being an author, anything about his life. It's his first and his last name, birth and death dates, and that's it. And I think that would have pleased him, though, of course, he would rather have been in Rochester than London. Yes.
Now, the funeral service itself was actually a very small number of people in attendance. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, it was a private funeral. The official record said that there were 13 people there, just family and immediate friends. But we actually know that there were 14 people, because his lover, Ellen Ternan, the young woman for whom he'd left his wife, was also there. But of course, the press weren't allowed to know anything about that, because Dickens and his family had really striven to make sure that his private life was kept out of the public eye. It was a very, very different time. Although he and his wife were legally separated, people would have been really, really angry if they'd known that he was having a relationship with somebody else.
Yes, well, I think for our audience too, I mean, that might be a bit of a surprise for them. People don't normally associate Charles Dickens with having a clandestine love affair with a younger woman, do they?
No, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people now know about the end of his marriage. It's been talked about a great deal. And people often judge the whole marriage by the end of it. But actually, they were married for 22 years before they separated. And the last few years, it became very difficult. But at the beginning, they were extremely well matched, and it was a very happy marriage. It was a love marriage. However, when he was 45, he fell in love with an 18-year-old actress. He and Catherine, his wife, had been struggling for some time. Their relationship had not been great, and poor Catherine was just desperate to try and hold on to the marriage. But unfortunately, Charles chose to go for a legal separation. But he was desperate not to let anybody know why, so the relationship was kept very secret. Ellen Ternan was the same age as his younger daughter, Katie, who was 18 when her father met this 18-year-old actress. So that caused a lot of tension. Having said which, Dickens was incredibly close to his children, and they did work through the problems as a family.
Yes, we'll talk a little bit more about Katie a little later on, because I know you're very passionate about Katie, aren't you? Let's move on to our next image. We have this image sort of in memory of Charles Dickens, and his death caused, I mean, a national outpouring of grief, didn't it? Well, really an international outpouring, really.
Absolutely. I mean, there were people just so astounded, because he was only 58. In that first photograph you showed, he looks a lot older than his mid-50s, but he was only 58 when he died. And most people had no idea that he'd been ill, and his family didn't know that his illness he'd been struggling with was something that was going to be fatal. So it was a huge shock, because Dickens always seemed to have so much energy. And it was a very, very sudden death. It's interesting to me that this is from the Illustrated Police News, because Dickens got to know the police very well. He would go out with the police, and he would walk around with them. He would visit what people considered the most dangerous parts of London, the slums. He went out with the river police. He became great friends with many of the detectives, and he wrote about his work with the police as well. So this is somebody who a lot of them knew personally.
Yes. In fact, I think the next image, we have a later copy of the death certificate. So officially, he died of what was then known as apoplexy. That's right? Which is a stroke, really, isn't it? I mean, a severe stroke.
He had a stroke. He'd been struggling for quite a long time with pain in his left side. His left foot would often become incredibly swollen. And in fact, you mentioned his second visit to America in the winter of 1867-68. For his farewell dinner, he was late, which is something, Dickens was never late. He was an absolute stickler for punctuality, but his foot had swelled up so much he couldn't physically get a shoe onto it. And he kept getting pains in the left side of his head and things. So yes, he was obviously suffering from a heart condition, but his death was a complete shock to people. His family were worried that he was working himself into an early grave. They were very frightened by just how hard he was working and how passionate he was about his work. He got very angry about injustice, and they felt that he was working himself into too much of a passion.
And he died actually at home, and I think now we've got an image of the house where he died. This is Gad's Hill Place, near Rochester in Kent, which he bought in the mid-1850s. And there's a photograph on the right of Dickens with some family members. Perhaps you could identify some of them. So this is officially where he died.
Yes, that's right. That's the house where he died. And on that picture that you see of him standing in the doorway, in the porch, you can see there's a couple of people sitting down on the step in front of him. The man sitting down reading a newspaper is Charlie Collins, who was Dickens's son-in-law, married to Katie, who is leaning on the other pillar. She's in the white dress with the black bodice. The girl standing next to her, between Katie and her father, is Katie's older sister, Mamie, Dickens's older daughter. Of his 10 children, he had 2 surviving daughters. And the woman sitting on the steps is Georgina Hogarth, who was Charles Dickens's sister-in-law. And very controversially, when Charles separated from his wife, Catherine, her sister, Georgina, who'd been living with the family since 1842, so 16 years, she chose to stay with her brother-in-law and the children, which caused a huge amount of gossip and people implying that she was his mistress. She wasn't, but there was that implication. The other man standing up on the step is a man called Henry Chorley, who was a great friend of Dickens's. He was a music critic and writer, a very well kind of respected musician. So there they are in 1865, which is 5 years before Charles Dickens died. There is a controversy. There's been a lot of things mentioned recently about did Dickens, because Dickens collapsed the day before he died, did he really collapse at Gad's Hill Place, or was he at his lover's home, a house where Ellen Ternan was living? I don't personally believe that, because in my research, in the books I've written about Dickens and his daughter Katie, I've come across a lot of information about the people who were in the house at the time when he collapsed. I also dispute the fact that the story it's a possibility, there's no proof, it's just been suggested, that he may have collapsed at Ellen Ternan's home and then been transported by carriage very hurriedly. He would have been in an awful lot of pain, and it would have been far quicker from her house to get to his office in Covent Garden. So had he collapsed at Ellen's home, I hope she would have been kind enough, because I think she was kind, to take him to his office, a much shorter journey than to take him all the way out on the country roads in a horse-drawn carriage to Kent. I think that would have been really, really awful. So I hope that no one would have done that. But I was giving a talk at the National Portrait Gallery a few years ago, and a woman came up to me at the end and said to me, my great-grandmother was one of the maids at Gad's Hill Place. And when Charles Dickens collapsed, she was the girl who had to run for the doctor. And then someone came up and pulled me aside. And when I turned back, this woman had left, and I have spent several years trying to find her. If by any chance she's watching this, please get in touch, because you hold this wonderful key to the mystery that has been surrounding the death of Charles Dickens. But there were accounts from his children of him collapsing and of them rushing to be there. So and my belief is that he collapsed at Gad's Hill Place and died almost exactly 24 hours to the minute after he collapsed.
Right. Now, Pepe mentioned in the introduction a little bit about Dickens' early life. Now, he wasn't a native Londoner. He was born in Portsmouth, and then he moved to Chatham in Kent, not too far from this house. And then he ends up coming to London. And as Pepe intimated, his father ends up in debt. And his father ends up here in this next image, I think we're going to see. This is
rather nice and bucolic here, doesn't it?
It looks what?
Looks rather nice and bucolic here. It wasn't when John Dickens was living there.
No, what we see here is the only surviving wall of the infamous Marshalsea prison, which was a debtor's prison, and this is where Dickens' father had ended up. And if we go into the next image, in fact, we can see the plaque that's on the wall. And perhaps you can tell us just a little bit about this this time in Dickens' life.
Yes, well, John Dickens, who, for anyone who knows David Copperfield, was the model for Mr. Micawber. John Dickens was somebody who could never live within his financial means. He actually had a good job. He was a clerk for the Navy, working in the payroll office, but he was always in debt. And as you mentioned, Charles Dickens' childhood was spent in the Kent countryside, and Dickens absolutely loved it. I think that's why, towards the end of his life, he wanted to move back to Kent, which is a very beautiful county, for those who don't know it, in the southeast of England. And then John's job was moved from Chatham, where he worked at the Chatham dockyards for the Navy, to the Navy's head office in London, which was at Somerset House on the banks of the Thames. Now, unfortunately, although the job was being moved to London, which was a much more expensive place to live, John's wages didn't increase in line with that. Now you would get paid more money for living and working in a more expensive part of the country, but that didn't happen then. And John was already in debt before he left Kent. They left Kent, leaving Charles behind at school. He was very happy at that school, a very kind headmaster who had young children, and Dickens lived with the family. He's not one of the headmasters and teachers that Dickens writes about so scathingly. They came later in his life. And then John Dickens, after living in London for a while, got himself into terrible debt and could no longer afford to pay Charles's school fees. And so he sent a letter to the school saying that Charles needed to come to London, and Charles moved to London very nervously, hoping there would be a school for him to go to, but there wasn't. And instead he was found a job working at Warren's blacking factory. And as Pepe said, his job was pasting the labels onto the jars of blacking and then wrapping them up. It wasn't the worst job that any child at that time had, and Dickens was aware of that, but it was a pretty miserable, scary existence for a little boy who had so longed to be a gentleman like Pip in Great Expectations. And to lose his education was very, very difficult. John went into the prison initially, and Charles lived with his mother and younger siblings. His older sister, Frances, she was a boarder at the Royal Academy of Music, a very brilliant musician. So her life was fairly uninterrupted at this time. But then Charles's mother and the younger siblings had no choice financially but to move into the Marshalsea prison and live in John's prison cell because they couldn't afford to pay rent. So young Charles lived by himself, and initially he was in Camden Town, and he would have to walk from the north of London all the way down to, for those who are watching who know London, roughly where Charing Cross Station is today, and work for 10 hours, and then walk across the river to go and visit his family in the Marshalsea prison in Southwark, and then walk back again. And that walk from the Marshalsea up to where he was living in Camden was almost exactly 4 miles. That's an 8-mile round trip and 10 hours of work at the age of 12. And then, as Pepe said, his family moved him so that he was living near them, near London Bridge, a place called Lamp Street, where there is the Charles Dickens Primary School today, which I think is rather wonderful, very near where he lived. And he then commuted a shorter distance, but still a pretty sad time for him. And people often say, well, it was less than a year. Why was it so bad for him? You know, why didn't he just kind of put up with it? Why did it affect him for the rest of his life? But when his father was arrested, Charles Dickens had no idea how his father would ever be able to afford to come out of prison. And in fact, the only reason that he could was because Charles's grandmother died and left both of her sons a small legacy. And John Dickens was able to afford to pay his debts off and come out of prison and go back to work. But for Charles, this was the most terrifying time. He became a street child, effectively. And he never lost those street smarts. You mentioned about him walking around London. He would walk around all night and just seems to have been very well able to take care of himself because he'd had to. He'd been a child of the streets at the age of 12, and he knew the Fagins, the Bill Sykeses, the Daniel Quilps, all these people he immortalizes in fiction they would have been based on the scary characters who terrified him as this little boy.
Yes. Now, zooming over from the south side of the river now to the north side of the river, we're going to get an aerial view in the next image. Oh, sorry, we're seeing a church here. This is actually St. George the Martyr, which is just across from where the wall of the Marshalsea prison is.
Yes.
And this is featured in Little Dorrit.
Right.
Little Dorrit's father is also in the Marshalsea prison. But now we're looking at an aerial view of a very large complex of buildings in Holborn, so just next to the City of London, just south of Bloomsbury. And this is the site of Furnival's Inn, which was sort of a set of chambers where Dickens was living in the early 1830s. And by this point, he's kind of on the road to success. And how did he first get into writing? He actually got a job as a journalist, didn't he, Lucinda?
Yes, well, he actually, after his father came out of prison, he was sent back to school for a few years, then taken out again at the age of 15 when John Dickens got into debt again, and was found a job as a solicitor's clerk. And that was something he really didn't enjoy, but it gave him a very good understanding of the legal system. And he soon taught himself shorthand and got a job as a journalist, a freelance journalist. One of his uncles had set up a newspaper, and so Charles was able to work for him. And actually, although he did not like being a solicitor's clerk, it stood him in very good stead for when he was reporting at the law courts and looking at legal cases. And this is something that anyone who's read his books will know comes through again and again, his understanding and also his contempt for much of the legal system, which he felt very much through his work was something that only benefited the wealthy and didn't help the poor at all. Now, Furnival's Inn, as you said, the name of this amazing complex, didn't look like this when Dickens lived there. This is a later one by the same architect, in fact, who created the Natural History Museum, Alfred Whitehouse, and it's a phenomenal building. When Dickens moved in, however, it was a previous incarnation, and it was a very new building, which had replaced the medieval inn. And the inns then didn't mean necessarily pubs. These were the inns of court where trainee solicitors would live and other people working in the legal world. And Charles Dickens moved in as a young bachelor and took his younger brother Fred with him to give his parents a bit of a break financially. And he took on financial responsibility for his little brother. And while he was living there, he was working as a journalist, and he wrote the short stories that we now know as Sketches by Boz. And the person who commissioned those was an editor called George Hogarth. And George Hogarth's daughter, eldest daughter, Catherine, became Charles Dickens's wife. So while he was living at Furnival's Inn, becoming a very well-known journalist, I mean, that people would ask for him by name because he was such an accurate reporter of political speeches and things, he was also writing these little short stories, his first foray into fiction, and then he got commissioned to work on the Pickwick Papers. And really from then on, his career just took off. But this was his bachelor quarters, and then once he married, he moved into a slightly larger apartment, still within the same complex, with Catherine, their first married home.
Lovely. And I think I'm right in thinking that then after their first child was born, Charlie, they then had to sort of get out, I think, because they couldn't have a child in the chambers. So they got their first proper house, and we're going to see that now. And this is very important, of course, to both of us and to all of our visitors. This is 48 Doughty Street in Bloomsbury, so just sort of north of the City of London. And this is where Dickens lived with Catherine for just under 3 years, 2.5 years.
Yes. Yes, so Charles Dickens, the lease on Furnival's Inn said that no children were permitted to live there. So when, as you say, Catherine gave birth to a child there, that was obviously not a great thing because then there was a baby in there. So they moved quite quickly. And 48 Doughty Street, which I love, I'm a patron of this museum, and it's just one of my favourite buildings in London. It's a beautiful place. You walk in and it still feels like a family home. At the moment, sadly, like everywhere, it's in lockdown. And I would really urge you to go to the museum's website. You can see a lot of their information on their website. And if anybody who's listening feels philanthropic, the museum is in desperate financial straits at the moment. And please do have a look at the donating link and share it on all your social media sites. But it's a wonderful house. You do feel when you get there as if there is still a family living there. And that's one of the things that makes it so successful as a museum. And they had a very happy family life here. So baby Charlie was already born, but then their two surviving daughters were born in this house. So Mamie in 1838 and then Katie in 1839. When Dickens moved in, he had written the Boz stories. He was working on the Pickwick Papers and starting Oliver Twist, which he completed in this house. And then he worked on Nicholas Nickleby, which he wrote while living here. So he moved in fairly well known, and he left incredibly famous just 2.5 years later. It was extraordinary. And he was now an international celebrity. He received letters from all over the world. He didn't own this house, by the way. He bought a long lease on this house. The only home that Dickens ever owned was the one in Kent that we saw earlier, Gad's Hill Place.
Yes, well, thank you for mentioning that. It is really wonderful, and we always make a point of taking our visitors to the museum as guides. We try and support the museum as much as we can, because it really is, and people often don't know about it. People often don't realise, and it really is as a jewel.
And I love the garden as well. So when it's reopened and the weather's nice, if you're in London and you can actually go to the Garden Cafe without going around the museum, so make it your go-to cafe in London, has a wonderful little secret garden hidden away that people are always so excited when they find.
It's great. Just moving to the next image. In fact, speaking of Oliver Twist, I think we have an image here of actually we have an image here of the Georgian Vulture Tavern, which is on the right, and this is tucked away in this wonderful, well, I describe it as a Dickensian alleyway, right in the heart of the city of London. And in the window of the tavern is a bust of the great man, which we can see here on the left. And this, in fact, is mentioned by name in the Pickwick Papers. That's right, isn't it, Lucinda?
Yeah, and it's just become such a Dickensian place. People who love Dickens, who come here, always want to visit Georgian Vulture, or the G&V to those who are in the know. It's also very close, as well as the Pickwick Papers Association, to where we believe Dickens envisaged Scrooge living in A Christmas Carol. I do a Christmas Carol walking tour, and I always take people around there to find Scrooge's home. And what I also love about this is it's just across the road, or the alleyway, from the site of the very first coffee house in London. So when you're walking around here, you get this really intimate feeling about being, as you say, in true Dickensian London, but also immersed in history. It's an astonishing place, and there's so many of these wonderful little places to discover in London. I'm longing for lockdown to be over so that we can go and walk down these little alleyways. Dickens loved walking around, and he would walk around often all night. He became quite insomniac at particular times of his life, and he would kind of want to see all these places at night and get to know the people who lived on the streets at night. He very much understood the nocturnal side of the city and what he called the houseless. We say homeless now. He called them houseless people who lived on the streets and made a different city by night to the one that most people knew at day.
Yes. We're going to move on now to our next image. We can see actually, we move on to the next one, I think, Pepe. This is actually just a little glimpse of a sort of another Victorian slum which was featured or inspired Oliver Twist. But this is another building which we often show people. This is just south of Holborn, just off Lincoln's Inn Fields. And it has the name painted on it, the Old Curiosity Shop, immortalised by Charles Dickens. It's certainly a very old building. It's 16th century. We're not entirely sure whether it is or was the Old Curiosity Shop. But
it's not the Old Curiosity Shop in that way. I mean, it was a building that Dickens knew, because it was a very, very old building, and so he would have passed it. That is a much later edition calling it the Old Curiosity Shop, and it's caused kind of debate over the years. But no, it's not the one that Dickens based it on. It's a very good bit of marketing by whoever first painted that on there, and people love to go and have their photograph taken next to it. And you know what? It's a wonderful building. So I say keep doing it, keep going and seeing it and getting your piece of London, because the fact that it's such a successful fake, I think, makes it a tourist attraction in itself.
Yes, and all publicity is good publicity. I think Dickens would have approved, wouldn't he?
Oh, he would totally have approved. Yes, he would have loved it. He was a great publicist.
Yeah. So we move on now. Just he after all this sort of having written 4 novels with the Old Curiosity Shop, he then took a bit of a sabbatical, and he went to America for the first time in 1842, and then, as we discussed, went back. Now, actually, your current book is about Dickens and his travels, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I nearly finished the first draft, and yes, Dickens was an amazing traveller, and I think many people don't realise quite how much Victorians travelled around. And as a young man, with the kind of financial privations that Dickens suffered, he longed to be able to do what the wealthy gentleman did, which was to go on a grand tour. And so for much of his life, he tried to recreate the idea that he could go and travel. And America was somewhere that became very important to him, because he was getting so many kind of fan letters sent to him from North America. And on this first trip, he visited the United States and Canada. And it was an amazing time. He and Catherine went away for 6 months. They had to leave their 4 young children behind, which was very common at the time. You didn't travel as a family. They both missed them so much that every other journey they did, they insisted they would take the children with them. And as a family, they traveled a great deal over the years. Dickens turned 30 on this first trip to America. He was fated in America, and he wasn't exactly taking a sabbatical in the way that we might see it, because he spent the whole time collecting material for his first travelogue, which was called American Notes. And I'd really recommend reading it. Still, you can still buy it today. The second travelogue he wrote a couple of years later was Pictures from Italy, which details their year living in Italy, their journey to Italy, the year living there as a family, and all the incredible things that they saw. So Dickens loved being a travel writer. And his observations about America, particularly for any Americans and Canadians listening to this, please do read it and find out what your country was like in 1842, because I think you'll be amazed. There were pigs wandering along Broadway, for example. It was just phenomenal.
I think there are still a few today, aren't there, Lucinda, probably? Different kind. If we move on to the next image, we now see a lovely image again. We're back to London. We can see the Inns of Court, which you mentioned just earlier. This is Middle Temple, and this fountain, which again, these are sort of hidden little places in London. This has a plaque on it, which has a quote from Martin Chuzzlewit, which is the 5th novel that Dickens wrote following his return from America, in which he was a bit sniffy. He was a bit sniffy about Americans, wasn't he? In it.
He was a bit sniffy about particular parts of America, and this was the problem with American Notes and Martin Chuzzlewit, is that Americans felt that he'd taken their hospitality and been rude. Actually, he wrote lots of wonderful things about America as well, and there were many things that he loved. But for example, in American Notes, he became absolutely incensed by slavery. He'd never witnessed it in action. Of course, it was still happening in America, and he was very, very angry about it. In Martin Chuzzlewit, he's quite rude about bits of America at the same time as also being quite laudatory, but people really didn't like that. And also the readers in the UK, for some reason, didn't particularly like Martin Chuzzlewit as much as his others. It was the only time in Dickens's career that his readership numbers dwindled during the serialization of his novel, because all of his major novels came out in either monthly or weekly parts in a magazine serial before they were published as novels, a bit like a soap opera on TV today.
Yes. And speaking of which, actually, in the background of this shot, there are buildings which also, in fact, feature in Great Expectations. Pip and Herbert Pocket, I believe, lodge in the buildings just in the back of the photograph.
And of course, this whole area comes into Bleak House as well. I mean, Dickens wrote about London. You can read Dickens almost as a kind of guide of London, because he writes so much about walking around the places that he knows personally. And he really did know them, because he just walked everywhere and absorbed information and learnt about the history, researched them for articles. Because one thing I think it's important to know, Dickens was a journalist his whole life. He didn't give up the journalism when he became a famous author. He continued to write what was often campaigning journalism, very hard-hitting journalism, for the rest of his life.
Yeah. If we move on to the next image, that links in quite nicely. We move ahead quite a lot now, just racing through his life. But I think we now have an image of, that's the quote from Martin Chuzzlewit. And then we have, I think, an image of Covent Garden. Now, Covent Garden was really one of the places that Dickens knew probably, well, better than most areas. I mean, he spent a lot of time here. You've got Wellington Street here on the left, and the building on the left has a blue plaque, which I've blown up in the photograph on the right, because this, in fact, is where he had his own magazine all the year round, from 1859 right up until literally, I mean, the day he died.
Yes.
And in the magazine, this is where he published weekly serializations of 2 novels, I believe.
And the previous magazine had been called Household Words, so that started in 1850. So Charles Dickens had, before that, published his novels in other people's magazines, but then decided he wanted to set up his own magazines. All the year round actually continued for decades after Dickens's death, because his son Charlie took on the editorship afterwards. He'd been working with his father. So it was a very important magazine. There were a couple of reasons for serializing his books. One was that Dickens knew that it was very expensive to be able to afford to buy books, and it was much more accessible to far more people if you could publish them in a magazine, because a magazine was far more affordable for a much larger sector of society. The other and very good reason was that Dickens was writing them as they were being published. He hadn't written the whole thing and then serialized it. He had a deadline every week or every month alongside all his other work. So it was an incredible workload. Dickens also gave a lot of work to other writers. He sought out young writers, and he gave lots of breaks to various writers. And people such as Wilkie Collins, Elizabeth Gaskell, they would publish in his magazine, and he would actively encourage them to write essays for him.
And he also used the magazines also in campaigns, particularly. I mean, he was an activist, really, wasn't he? He was very vocal in the abolition of, for example, public hangings in London, which did in fact get abolished in 1868.
Yes,
largely thanks to him.
Yeah. People think he often got rid of hanging altogether. As you said, it was public hanging, it was public executions, and these spectacles that were this very macabre, awful day out where people would take the whole family to go and watch people being hanged. And Dickens was so appalled by this. He was a constant campaigner. He travelled to Wales to discover about a really heartbreaking shipwreck, and the vicar who was painstakingly burying all of the drowned bodies and writing letters to all their family. He went up to the northeast of England to investigate a mining disaster and wrote very heartbreakingly about it. He encouraged people to tell him about things that he should know about. And one of his great campaigns was being one of the first people to not only raise awareness, but also help to raise funds for the creation of Great Ormond Street Hospital. But then it was called the Hospital for Sick Children. We now know it as Great Ormond Street Hospital. Today, one of the most important hospitals in the world, really wouldn't be there without that early pioneering work of Charles Dickens, who was approached by the doctors who wanted to found it, saying, we really need to get people to understand that a hospital is a good place to bring their children to. And it was the first hospital that was created purely with children in mind.
And of course, it's just around the corner from the Dickens Museum at 48 Doughty Street. So it's on our Dickens route. And if we just go to our final image, I think it's our final image. So this is a painting called Dickens' Dream, which I love. And I think it just sort of, sums up this sort of whole legacy of Dickens, him sitting in his chair away from his desk, surrounded by some of his 2,000 plus characters that he created, all of which, of course, have entered, the national psyche. So just to sort of wind up, hopefully we'll have some questions in a moment. But for our audience out there, if they haven't perhaps picked up a Dickens novel in a long time, or maybe they first read a Dickens novel at school, or maybe they've never read a Dickens novel, what would be your recommendation, Lucinda, to get? I know it's a hard question.
I have to say, if you've never read any Dickens, the first thing you should read, no matter how unseasonal, is A Christmas Carol. Because apart from being an absolutely amazing story, it's very slim, it's a novella, and it's just a story that, because you will recognise parts of it, you will find the language wonderful. Once you have started to understand Dickens's language, which is just beautiful, witty, fascinating, I think you will really love his works. I personally love some of the huger novels, things like Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House, but people are often put off by the size of them. If that's you, I would suggest going for one of the smaller ones to start off with. I love A Tale of Two Cities. It's one of my favourites. Oliver Twist, which is probably far more hard-hitting and upsetting than many people realise, because they're so used to the musical. And as with many of Dickens's novels, particularly those with central child characters like Little Nell, who we see here sitting on Dickens's knee, Pip in Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, the realities of how children were treated in the 19th century are heartbreaking, but it's so worth reading. And please remember that Dickens's humour is wonderful. So if you're finding the beginning a little bit sad, don't worry, it gets a lot better and it gets a lot funnier. And I think just learn to love his language. It's beautiful.
And speaking of David Copperfield, of course, the recent film came out in the UK, and I think it's about to be released in the US. I saw it. You obviously saw it. I think you interviewed the director and writer yesterday, Armando Iannucci. Did you love it? I thought it was fantastic.
I absolutely loved it. I thought it was wonderful. It's so funny. And I don't think many people expected that they would go and see David Copperfield and come out filled with the kind of joy. I laughed so much. The casting is superb. And yes, for any watchers in North America, it is going on general release there on the 13th of June this year. And so in a few days' time. And that's also when it's going to be available to stream in the UK as well. It is going to various other parts of the world soon. And it's just really, really worth seeing. I loved it. It's a brilliant film. Stellar cast, but every single actor is perfectly chosen for that role.
Wonderful. Now, listen, I don't know if we have any questions that have come in, whether Pepe...
Hi guys.
Hello. But first of all, to say thank you so much, Lucinda, for joining us today. It's been wonderful to have you and sharing your extensive knowledge and enthusiasm for Dickens. And I know you, as I, and all of our colleagues, we all look forward to welcoming our visitors back. You can find out more about Lucinda at lucindahawksley.com and all of her many books about Dickens and otherwise.
One of them.
Oh yes, and this is your book about Katie. Yes, and they're all terrific. I've read them all.
Thank you.
Yes, tell us more about your latest book, Lucinda. What's your latest book called?
Well, the book that's out at the moment is Charles Dickens' daughter, Dickens' artist daughter, Katie. She was a portrait painter, fascinating woman, one of the girls who was born inside what is now the Dickens Museum. This is a painting of her on the cover by John Everett Millais, the great pre-Raphaelite, who was a friend of hers. Her life was fascinating. And I've had people say, oh, I loved your novel. And I think, that's good. Sounds like a novel. And then very unseasonable, Dickens and Christmas. I don't know if you can see that. I love Dickens and I love Christmas. So I had to write this book. The one I'm working on at the moment is Dickens and Travel. But I've written lots of books that aren't about Dickens. I'm an art historian and a social historian. So please do, check out my books on lucindahawksley.com or at Lucinda Hawksley is my Twitter and Instagram.
Thank you so much. We've had some wonderful comments, Lucinda. It's been great watching you two bat Dickens facts over the net. It's like a great game of Dickens tennis. I think maybe we need to get you back in the future for more. Now, for those of you that hopefully have enjoyed, I'm sure you've enjoyed today's program, I just want to share my screen with you again, if that's okay, and just show you the Guide London website. Now, we realize we can't guide you in the real world currently, but you might want to consider a Charles Dickens virtual tour. So this is our current website. You can scroll down by tour subject, but if you click on the London virtual tour portal, you can see on your screen now, takes you to our new London virtual tour landing page. And there's lots of suggestions for ideas for London virtual tours. And Charles Dickens has been one of our most popular tours on the website for a couple of years now. And then you go to the bottom of the page, you fill in the guide match form, and that will be sent to a number of guides who should reply to you, hopefully pretty soon afterwards. Now, I can't not put Simon's details on the screen as well. So if people want to find you, Simon, on the Guide London website, they can find you under Simon Whitehouse. And they can also find you on Instagram as well at Blue Badge Simon. And I know you post lots of stories on there. So hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, we've whetted your appetite today about the world of Charles Dickens. Please make sure, if this is the first time you are watching today, to share this broadcast with your friends. Don't forget, we go out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, simultaneously on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter at 4 o'clock London time. And on Friday, we've got a programme devoted to another very famous British figure, arguably the most famous nurse in history, Florence Nightingale. So stay safe and well. Thank you to Lucinda and Simon, and we'll see you with a programme devoted to Florence Nightingale on Friday at 4 o'clock. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.